I never thought my hands would shake just from turning over a piece of paper. But that afternoon, in the living room where I grew up, my hands truly trembled. My eyes were locked on the cold, impersonal lines printed across the legal documents spread over the ebony wood table. The very documents I had secretly safeguarded for years with everything I had. Across from me, my younger brother Jacob was wearing a smug, almost terrifying smile, as if he had just won a life or math chess game I didn't even know I was playing. Sitting beside him, my parents sat upright, faces beaming like they'd just accomplished something sacred. "We're officially signing the transfer of Ravenhill to Jacob today," my father announced, his eyes glowing with pride. None of them knew that nearly 2 decades ago, my grandfather, Franklin Westbrook, had quietly established a trust in his own name, and the sole legal trustee with full control over Ravenhill was me. I'm Charlie Westbrook, the eldest daughter in a prestigious family of attorneys spanning 3 generations in the state of Virginia. The 3-story granite mansion known as Ravenhill, nestled atop a green hill just outside Charlottesville, is the symbol of our family's legacy. A place that has hosted weddings, funerals, and summer parties the entire community looked forward to. I moved out when I started working in Washington, D.C., but I never missed returning on the second weekend of every month. A tradition my parents clung to like it was the last breath of their golden era. This time was no different. I received a message from my mother. "Come home this weekend, sweetheart. We have some wonderful news to share. Jacob and Jessica will be there too." No hints, no details. I suspected nothing, just assumed it was another family gathering like always. I had no idea I was about to witness the most calculated betrayal of my life. My green pickup truck pulled up in front of the wrought iron gate, the same one I used to chalk doodles on when I was 8. Beyond it, Ravenhill still stood tall, its light gray roof glinting in the sun, climbing roses covering the front porch. Thanks to the gardener I paid for every month. I stepped out, carrying a bottle of 2010 Bordeaux, my father's favorite, part of a ritual I always honored. When I set foot on the Italian tile foyer, the familiar scent of old oak and soft lavender hit me in the chest. This was still my home. At least, I used to believe so. "Charlie! You're here!" My mother, Marilyn, came out from the kitchen, still holding a dish towel, her silver hair neatly pinned back. She hugged me. Briefly, distractedly, like she had something more urgent on her mind. "Everyone's in the study. Go on in, your father wants to talk." I hadn't even taken off my coat when I heard laughter from the next room. Walking through the tall glass doors, I saw my father, Donald, leaning over a thick stack of papers with Jacob and Jessica. Each of them held a glass of whiskey. The celebration had already started, without me. "Perfect timing, Charlie." My father looked up, his voice full of excitement. He's 68 now, but still carries the commanding presence of a seasoned lawyer. Perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, expensive tie immaculately straight. "We just finalized the agreement to transfer Ravenhill to Jacob. Everything will be completed within the next 2 weeks." I stood frozen. It felt like someone had hit me square in the forehead. I heard the words, but they didn't make sense, even as they echoed in my head. Transfer Ravenhill to Jacob. I couldn't comprehend why. Why him? Jacob turned toward me, eyes gleaming with triumph. "You know, I think the timing is perfect. Jessica and I are starting a family. Ravenhill will be the perfect home." Jessica smiled awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to say. She was the polished type, always standing by her husband's side, never looking at me for more than 3 seconds. I tried to stay calm. My voice was low and steady. "Did either of you ever consider talking to me first? Or was this decision already made?" My father sighed, as if I had asked something completely unreasonable. "You live in the city, busy with your work at the museum. You've never shown interest in staying at Ravenhill. Meanwhile, Jacob works at the family law firm, and Jessica's expecting. This just makes the most sense." I couldn't say a word. I couldn't even bring myself to explain that for the past 10 years, I had been the one paying the property taxes, fixing the leaking roof, and covering the gardener's wages, all from my grandfather's trust fund, which only the family lawyer and I knew about. They were preparing to hand over something they didn't even legally own. And that was only the tip of the iceberg. I set the wine bottle down on the table and turned to face Jacob, my 32-year-old brother, coddled like he was the center of the universe, and silently thought to myself, "You think Ravenhill is yours? Just wait." I left Ravenhill that afternoon with a lump burning in my throat. The anger didn't explode. It simmered, searing every thought from the inside out. I drove down the hill, past the gravel road leading back into downtown Charlottesville, trying not to slam the gas pedal. If Jacob knew that just 3 years ago that house was on the brink of foreclosure, his smug little smile might just fade away. For over a decade, I had lived like a shadow in my own family, always present, always reliable, but never truly seen. I started transferring money to Ravenhill when I was 26. Right after landing my first job at the Museum of American History in D.C., my grandfather, Franklin Westbrook, had just passed away. Before he died, he called me into his study, where a portrait of his younger self still hung behind the leather armchair. He handed me a thick sealed envelope and said something I've never forgotten. "Ravenhill isn't just land. It's the blood and bones of this family. I chose you, Charlie, not because you're the eldest, but because you're the only one who truly understands what that means." Inside the envelope were the documents of a trust my grandfather had established when I was 11. The name Franklin Westbrook Trust was clearly printed on the paperwork. An independent legal trust that owned Ravenhill and the entire surrounding estate, with me as the sole legal trustee after his death. The only condition: keep everything secret until the protection of Ravenhill must come to light. And I kept that promise. For 10 years I told no one, not a word to my parents, or to Jacob. I let them continue to believe they were in charge, and while they were blind to the truth, I gritted my teeth and covered every debt the estate incurred, from property taxes to the roof repairs in 2016, even replacing the entire plumbing system that had rusted since the 80s. Each year I transferred around $40,000 from my personal account into the trust. Money I could have used to buy my own home, travel, or even invest in my future. I gave it all up. My father, Donald, never asked how I was doing in D.C., only why I hadn't bought a new car after working for so many years. My mother was gentler, but the way she brushed past everything I said about my work, as if preserving historical artifacts was just a hobby, cut deeper than silence. Meanwhile, Jacob was treated like royalty. He got a brand new BMW the moment he graduated from law school, and I still remember the gleam in my mother's eyes when he showed off the keys at dinner while I quietly picked at my vegetables. That same year I had been awarded a full doctoral scholarship in cultural heritage, conservation, but no one mentioned it. They only asked, "What are you going to do with that degree? Become a librarian?" I gave a strained smile, and kept sending money to Ravenhill. Once, I asked my father why no one ever acknowledged my role in keeping Ravenhill running. He replied with just one sentence: "You don't need recognition to do the right thing, Charlie. If you do, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons." That hollow philosophy sounded noble until it came from someone who had just removed his daughter's name from the inheritance list without a single conversation. I'm not stupid. I know Ravenhill is no longer a legacy to them, it's an asset. And in the game of assets, Jacob is the shinier piece. He's the son, the lawyer in the family firm, married and expecting a child. All the things my parents see as right and continuity. I, on the other hand, am a 36-year-old single woman, working in a museum, renting an apartment in Georgetown. I don't fit into the traditional picture they've painted, even though I'm the only one who's kept that place from falling apart. I didn't speak up, not once. Even when I saw the $18,000 invoice for repainting the porch they sent to our shared email and my father casually forwarded it with, "Can you take care of this for me?" I still said nothing. I still paid. I did it for my grandfather. Because I knew he believed in me. But that day, when I heard my father say that Ravenhill will belong to Jacob and Jessica in 2 weeks, something cracked inside me. Not with a loud noise, but like a hairline fracture in a column. Quiet, but irreversible. I knew it was time to use my voice. And more than that, it was time to bring the Franklin Westbrook Trust into the light. I didn't sleep at all that night. The yellow lamplight reflecting on the ceiling of my small Georgetown apartment made me feel like I was exposed in a public square. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob's grinning face beside that thick stack of papers. Transfer of Ravenhill. I could still hear every word, like they were tapping against my temples one by one. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, I had made up my mind. I brewed a strong cup of coffee and opened the safe in my bookshelf where I kept the original documents of the Franklin Westbrook Trust, along with legal papers and financial records from the past 10 years. All of it was backed up, notarized, and meticulously organized. If needed, it would take me less than an hour to prove that Ravenhill was not my parents' property, and that they had no legal right to transfer it to anyone, including Jacob. But the hard part wasn't the law. The hard part was me. I had stayed silent for so long. If I suddenly pushed back, they would see me as a traitor, nothing more. They wouldn't care about the truth. They would only feel humiliated. Because I dared to expose them. In a game they thought they had already won. And worst of all, I wasn't sure I wanted them to know. Because once I said it, everything would change. There would be no room left for kindness, or for whatever they thought family unity was. I would become the obstacle in their succession plan, and I knew my father, Donald, would do whatever it took to regain control. Even if it meant taking his own daughter to court. But I couldn't let them keep acting illegally. This wasn't just my issue anymore. It was my grandfather's legacy. The legal responsibility he entrusted to me. I had no right to ignore it just because I didn't want to cause trouble. I knew I needed legal backup. The only person who could help me now was Helen Carter, my grandfather's personal attorney, and the one who helped him set up the trust back in 2002. Helen is 72 now, semi-retired but still maintaining a small office downtown. I scheduled a meeting with her that morning at 10 a.m., at a discreet cafe near City Hall. When I arrived, she was already there, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, her eyes as sharp as the day I first met her at my grandfather's funeral. "Charlie," she said, her voice low and smooth like old jazz. "You're here about Ravenhill, aren't you?" I nodded and pulled the folder from my leather bag. She read every page carefully, not skipping a single comma. When she reached the section naming me as sole trustee, she gave a slight nod. "The documents are intact. Everything is still legally binding. The Franklin Westbrook Trust is the sole legal owner of the Ravenhill estate. No one has the right to transfer that property without your written consent. Not even your parents." I swallowed hard. Hearing it from a lawyer wasn't like saying it to myself. It carried weight. It was truth with authority. "But if I speak up," I hesitated, "everything will fall apart. They'll never see me the same again." "They never saw you for who you truly are, Charlie," Helen said, her tone firm and unsentimental. "And by letting them keep breaking the law, you're betraying the one person who believed in you more than anyone. Your grandfather." I had nothing left to say. She handed me a new business card. "In case you need me to step in officially. But I suggest you take control of the narrative. Don't let them find out the truth from the title office. That would be worse." That afternoon, when I returned to my office at the museum, I found an email from my mother waiting. Subject line: "Urgent. Need your signature ASAP. Dear Charlie, your dad just sent the Ravenhill transfer documents to Jacob's lawyer, and they need you to sign a waiver to officially relinquish your inheritance rights. It's simple, nothing serious, just a legal formality. I know you're busy, so I already printed the papers and will bring them home this Saturday for you to sign. Thank you. Love you, Mom." I stared at that last line. Just a legal formality. Everything is always simple to them. unless it involves power. I took a deep breath and typed a single sentence. Mom, I think it's time we have an honest conversation about Ravenhill. And about Grandpa. I hit send. And in that moment I knew. There was no turning back. I arrived at the old law office on the third floor of a red brick building near Court Square at 3 p.m. sharp. The frosted glass door bore faded silver lettering, Carter and Morgan, legal counsel since 1962. I had come here a few times with Grandpa as a child, swinging my legs on an oak chair while he and the lawyer talked about something loud and secret. Today, I returned. Not as an 8-year-old girl, but as the one holding what my family didn't know existed. The legal ownership of Ravenhill. Helen wasn't in today, but she had arranged for me to meet Mr. Samuel Morgan, the firm's co-founder, now 78 years old, and the man who had personally helped my grandfather draft the Franklin Westbrook Trust. The secretary led me into a walnut-paneled room, where the afternoon sun filtered through bamboo blinds, casting a soft glow on the faded Turkish rug. Samuel sat behind his desk, holding a cup of tea, horn-rimmed glasses resting low on his nose. When I stepped in, he looked up, his blue-gray eyes gleaming with the sharpness of someone well acquainted with other people's secrets. Charlie Westbrook, he said, his voice low and gravelly like burned wood. You've grown up. I nodded. I think it's time we talk about Ravenhill. Without any further explanation, I placed the file on the table. He opened it and turned each page slowly. Every flip of a page sliced away another illusion my parents had built over the years. Original copies, I said, with tax payment records and annual maintenance expenses. Everything was paid through the trust account. Except in some urgent cases, where I transferred funds from my personal account. Mr. Morgan said nothing for a long while. After reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the armrest. You know, he began, very few people keep their promises to the dead for this long. Franklin once told me, Charlie won't need to be recognized to do what's right. But I want to make sure that when the time comes, she won't be alone. I froze. Mr. Morgan opened a drawer and pulled out a yellowed envelope, carefully sealed with red wax. He left this for you, told me to give it to you only if the trust was ever in jeopardy, or when you were mature enough to decide what's right. I took it. On the front was that familiar handwriting. For Charlie, when the time comes. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a long letter, written in blue ink on thick paper. His handwriting was still there, bold, steady, full of conviction. My dearest Charlie. If you're reading this, it means you've reached the moment I've always feared. When Ravenhill is no longer a symbol of tradition, but a battleground for power and selfishness. I didn't choose you because you're the oldest, or because you're a girl. I chose you because you see the value of this place beyond its bricks and columns. You don't need anyone's permission to protect this legacy, you just need to remember, justice is not silence. You have the right, and the responsibility, to do what's right. I believe in you, always. I folded the letter. My eyes were dry but my throat felt like it was being crushed. Every word took me back to those days walking Ravenhill with Grandpa, as he showed me each old brick, each architectural detail, telling stories of the 5 generations who lived there. Not to brag, but to teach me to value it. Samuel placed his hand on the file, his voice firm. Charlie, this trust is fully legal. It was established under Virginia law in 2002, properly notarized, and lists you as the sole trustee. You have full authority to approve or deny any change in ownership involving Ravenhill. No one, not even your parents, can override that without your signature. I took a deep breath. My head felt like a tightly wound string. Years of silence, of swallowing anger just to protect the illusion of a close-knit family. It was all about to end. What if they've already signed a contract with a third party? I asked. Any such transaction would be immediately voided once the title office discovers the property is legally owned by the Franklin Westbrook Trust, not by Mr. Donald or Mrs. Marilyn Westbrook. But But, he paused. If you remain silent, it will evolve into a legal dispute that I can assure you will be painful and public. I looked him straight in the eye. So now it's time to speak up? Samuel Morgan nodded slowly. Yes, and I'll stand with you. I left the office in silence, my grandfather's letter tucked inside my bag, heavier than anything I'd ever carried. The gray afternoon sky felt like a warning of the storm to come. And this time, I would be the one to bring it. I sat in my car for a long time after leaving Morgan's office, still gripping my grandfather's letter like it was the last shield between me and the undercurrent threatening to sweep everything away. Finally, I unlocked my phone and scrolled through my contacts to the name I'd been avoiding all week. Graham Sutton. The attorney handling Ravenhill's transfer documents. Graham was a senior partner at the law firm my father had trusted for nearly 2 decades. He was in his 40s, meticulous, sharp, and most importantly, neutral. That's why, if I wanted to stop this unauthorized transfer without turning it into a full-blown family war, Graham was my only starting point. I made the call. Sutton speaking. Hi Graham, this is Charlie Westbrook. I'd like to meet with you today, it's about Ravenhill. There was a brief pause, then his voice turned cautious. I'm currently finalizing the paperwork with Mr. Donald and Jacob. If you'd like to review the terms. No, I cut in. I'm not here to review anything. I'm here to provide information. Information that will render the entire transfer process invalid. He went silent. What did you say? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. I'll be at your office at 3 p.m. I need 45 minutes. You'll want to hear this. I didn't wait for a response. I hung up. Graham met me in the lobby on the 15th floor of a sleek glass tower in downtown Charlottesville, dressed in a flawless gray suit like he'd just walked out of a global finance summit. He led me into a small private conference room. No glass walls, just a long walnut table and a polished silver tray with a carafe of water. Ms. Westbrook, he said, still guarded. I'm very curious about this information you mentioned. I opened my bag and pulled out the Franklin Westbrook Trust file, laying each page on the table like the final hand in a high-stakes game. Graham flipped through them, reading carefully. When he reached the section confirming the trust's ownership, I saw his lips press together. Then he looked up. His eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the sharp alertness of a lawyer who realized he was about to be swept into a storm. You're telling me Ravenhill isn't currently owned by Mr. and Mrs. Donald? He asked slowly. I'm not just telling you, this is legal proof, I said. The trust was created in 2002, my grandfather was the founder, I am the sole legal trustee, as recorded and certified by the Albemarle County Clerk's Office. And Mr. Donald doesn't know about this. They believe they're the owners, but on paper, they've had no legal claim for over a decade. Graham leaned back in his chair, ran his hands over his face, and exhaled like someone who just learned his client had filed for bankruptcy. I'll be honest with you, Charlie. If this is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then the entire transfer process I've been overseeing is illegal. I nodded. And I don't want it to get that far. What do you want? I looked him directly in the eye. I want to stop the transfer before it's notarized. But I don't want to use the legal card as a weapon. I want a conversation, face to face, with all parties present. And I need you, as the attorney overseeing the transfer, to be there to confirm the facts. Graham blinked. He clearly hadn't expected that. You want me to take your side? I want you to take the side of the truth. I'm not asking you to betray your clients. But if you proceed with this transfer without disclosing the existence of the trust, the court will nullify the entire deal. And that will become a scandal, not just for my family, but for your firm. He paused, then nodded slightly. I understand. A long silence followed before Graham finally spoke again. If you agree, I'll arrange a meeting at Ravenhill tomorrow evening, a family meeting. I'll inform Mr. Donald and Jacob that there are legal matters that need to be clarified. The rest? I'll leave for you to say. I tightened my grip on my handbag, my heart feeling like it was clenched in someone else's fist. But I nodded. I'll be there, with all the documents, and with the truth. Graham stood and extended his hand to me. His handshake was firm, decisive. No more hesitation. Good luck, Charlie. Looks like your family is in for a memorable evening. The next evening, light rain fell as I drove through Ravenhill's rusted iron gates. Tiny droplets traced their way down the windshield like endless question marks echoing through my mind. How will they react? Denial? Anger? Or will they finally see me differently? Jacob's SUV sat parked arrogantly right in front of the main entrance, its tires still caked with mud. I parked a little further back, beneath the old oak tree where I used to play hide-and-seek with Grandpa, then stepped out with the green leather folder clutched tightly in my hands. Inside it was everything: the trust documents, bank statements, repair receipts, property ownership records. Tonight, it would all be laid bare. The large sitting room glowed brightly as I walked in. My mother, Marilyn, stood by the fireplace holding a glass of white wine. My father, Donald, sat upright in a leather armchair, legs crossed, eyes cold as steel. Jacob lounged on the sofa, wearing the smug expression of someone who thought this meeting was just a dull formality. Graham Sutton stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Charlie, my mother forced a smile. You finally made it. We were just discussing renovation plans for Ravenhill. Jacob had some great ideas for the kitchen. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the document folder on the oak coffee table and calmly opened it. We're not discussing kitchens tonight, I said, my voice steady and clear. We're discussing the truth and the legal ownership of Ravenhill. The room fell silent. I pulled out the first document, the notarized copy of the Franklin Westbrook Trust, and slid it toward my father. This is the trust Grandpa established in 2002. It is the sole legal owner of Ravenhill. He transferred full ownership into it. And I have been the sole trustee since I was 21. My father didn't touch the papers, he just glared at me. What are you talking about? We're the ones on the deed. I've paid the taxes. You haven't paid a cent in the last 10 years, I interrupted. I have, from the trust, and when that wasn't enough, from my personal account. Here are the statements. Bank records, tax receipts, roof repairs, electrical system upgrades, even Mrs. Jenny's wages. Everything came from me. I pushed the next stack of papers toward my mother. Her face went pale as she scanned the figures. She had always prided herself on managing the family finances, but now, the truth had pushed her far out of her comfort zone. Jacob jumped up. Hold on, are you saying you own this place? That you get to make all the decisions? That's ridiculous. Mom and Dad planned a legal transfer. Graham, what's going on? All eyes turned to Graham. He didn't flinch. I've verified the legal standing of the documents Charlie provided. The trust is fully valid. Ravenhill has belonged to that trust for over a decade. The Donald family is no longer the legal owner. And Charlie, as trustee, has full authority over any decisions involving this property. This is betrayal, my father growled. You went behind our backs and took everything, and now you come here to lecture us? I looked straight at him, my voice low but firm. No, Dad, I protected Ravenhill when you and Mom abandoned it. I didn't do it to take over. I did it because I believed in Grandpa's legacy, the one you always called sacred, and yet almost handed over to Jacob like it was some throwaway prize. A beat of silence. I took a deep breath. But I'm not here to take Ravenhill back. I'm here to offer a deal. Jacob scoffed. A deal? What, you think you're the queen now? I ignored him and turned to my parents. If Jacob still wants to live here, I won't stop him. But there are conditions. 1. He must respect the historical integrity of Ravenhill. Any major renovations must be reviewed and approved. 2. He must share financial responsibility for maintenance, no more living comfortably off someone else's back. 3. My role must be clearly acknowledged. No more treating me like the museum girl. My mother closed her eyes. My father turned away. Jacob's face darkened, while Graham scribbled notes. "If you don't agree," I said quietly, "I'll convert Ravenhill into a heritage conservation site. No private residents allowed. Not even family." The silence stretched on, like a sentence being handed down. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice as soft as a sigh. "You've changed, Charlie." I smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but the kind that comes with relief after years of being dismissed. "No, Mom, I haven't changed, I've just stopped putting up with it." 2 days after the stormy family meeting, I returned to Ravenhill. This time with a different mindset. No longer the overlooked daughter, no longer the secret keeper, I came back as the person Grandpa trusted with authority. And now, the one deciding the fate of this house. Graham had prepared a memorandum, and I brought a revised draft of the negotiation terms I'd stayed up all night refining. The meeting took place in the library, the only room in Ravenhill where I'd ever felt truly seen. Perhaps because it still bore my grandfather's presence. My father, Donald, looked tired but calm. My mother, Marilyn, seemed more composed, though her gaze held a trace of caution. Jacob couldn't hide his irritation, but at least this time he didn't fire off a sarcastic remark when I walked in. Graham began. "We're here to discuss a collaborative proposal between all parties to ensure Ravenhill is managed legally, preserved as a heritage site, and that stability is maintained within the family." I nodded and took out my draft. "I've reviewed the family's counterproposal, and I agree in principle to 3 points. First, we establish a nonprofit, the Westbrook Heritage Foundation, to oversee finances, maintenance, and all operations related to Ravenhill." I looked at my father. "This foundation would have a 4-member board: you, Mom, Jacob, and myself. However, any expenditure over $25,000 must be approved by at least 3 board members." Donald nodded slowly. "That's fair. It gives everyone a voice, but still ensures financial oversight." "Second," I continued, "Jacob and Madison may proceed with their plan to move into the East Wing, with some renovation privileges, provided they don't interfere with the historically protected architecture outlined in the 2018 Preservation Review." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "And who decides what qualifies as interference?" "I'll work with an independent preservation expert," I replied without hesitation. "And all plans must be approved by the Foundation's board." He leaned back in his chair and said nothing more. "Finally," I said, my voice lowering slightly, "I remain the sole legal trustee of the Franklin Westbrook Trust. I retain final veto power over any major changes to Ravenhill." A wave of silence swept through the room. I knew they didn't like it, but that part wasn't up for negotiation. This was Grandpa's legacy, not a piece of land to be divvied up like a poker pot. Marilyn broke the tension with an unexpected question. "And the money you spent, do you want to be reimbursed?" I shook my head. "No, but I want it formally documented in the Foundation's records. This is the financial contribution log over the past 10 years, totaling $537,400. That includes maintenance costs, repairs, property taxes, staff wages. I don't want a cent back, but I want the truth acknowledged." Donald sat still, eyes fixed on the spreadsheet. At last he spoke. His voice low, raspy, but no longer bitter. "Charlie, I used to think you lived far away, disconnected, not really caring about Ravenhill. But it seems I was wrong." I swallowed hard. "You weren't wrong, Dad, you just didn't look closely. I didn't stay away because I didn't care. I stayed away because I knew that if I stayed close, I'd always be a shadow in someone else's version of the story." Marilyn placed her hand gently on the table. "Then, from now on, can we rewrite that story, together?" I nodded. Graham stood gathering the papers. "I'll revise the agreement based on today's terms. If there are no further disputes, we can sign it officially within the week." Jacob stood, walked toward me, and slowly held out his hand. For the first time since everything had unraveled. I'll try, not for you, but for Ravenhill." I shook his hand. For both of us, Jacob, and for Grandpa. As I left Ravenhill that afternoon, the clouds had cleared, and the sky was high and crisp. Though the cracks between me and my family wouldn't heal overnight, at least we had begun to rebuild. Not with lies but with truth. And long overdue recognition. 3 weeks after that historic negotiation, we walked together into a law office in downtown Charleston. Not as rivals battling over inheritance, but as a family trying to restore balance after years of fracture. The sleek modern glass building stood in stark contrast to the worn wooden halls of Ravenhill. But today, it marked a turning point that could not be undone. Graham Sutton had everything prepared. The charter for the Westbrook Heritage Foundation, financial commitments from each member, operating regulations, and finally, the official record of the more than $500,000 I had spent over the last 10 years to keep Ravenhill from falling apart. I wore a simple charcoal suit, my hair tied up. No longer the silent daughter at dinners filled with dismissive glances. Today I was the representative of Grandpa's will, walking into that room with full clarity of purpose. My father Donald looked weary but composed. My mother Marilyn wore lighter makeup than usual, and sat more quietly than I had ever seen her. Jacob arrived last, with his wife Madison, who had stayed neutral throughout the entire dispute. But the most unexpected presence was Catherine, Jacob's ex-wife, who came with me. Though they had divorced quietly 2 years ago, Catherine and I had remained friendly through her continued support for the museum. This time, she volunteered to be my witness and emotional support. "I know I'm no longer part of that house," she said softly as we waited outside the conference room. "But Ravenhill isn't just a place. It's memory. And memories should be preserved by someone who understands them." Graham opened the proceedings with his calm, professional tone. "We're here to formally sign the legal documents establishing the Ravenhill Preservation Trust and recognizing the new management structure." Each person signed in turn. When it was my turn, I put pen to paper with a strange feeling. Not victory, but closure. 10 years of quiet contribution, endurance, and silence. All sealed with a signature and a red stamp. When it came time to acknowledge the financial contributions, Graham looked up, his voice more formal. "We officially recognize the total contribution of $537,400 from Ms. Charlotte Westbrook. Funds, drawn entirely from her personal resources, to maintain, repair and preserve Ravenhill from 2013 to 2023. Without this contribution, the estate may not have survived to the present day." Jacob sat frozen. He said nothing, but I saw his eyes linger on the printed photo of the new roof, installed in 2017. The one I had emailed to the contractor while he and Dad were golfing in Florida. When all the documents had been signed, we remained seated in the conference room. No one rushed to leave. A quiet moment settled over people who once thought they could never sit at the same table again. Then, unexpectedly, Catherine stood up, raising her glass of water. "I know I'm no longer part of this story, but I'd like to say one thing. If anyone deserves to represent Ravenhill, not just in name but in spirit, it's Charlie. She didn't just keep the house standing. She preserved the memory and identity of this family." My throat tightened. I couldn't speak for a moment. My father nodded slightly, then stood. "I used to think you were someone who lived in the past, clinging to things that were old and fading. But today, I see. You're the only one brave enough to keep the past from being rewritten. And I know. Your grandfather was right to trust you." Madison gave me a small smile. For the first time since everything began. There was no warmth between us, but something had shifted. Maybe it was acknowledgement. Maybe quiet gratitude? As we left the office, I slowed my steps, gazing at the glass buildings reflecting the soft afternoon light of Charleston. Catherine walked beside me, carrying the folder of documents. "So it's done," she said gently. I smiled faintly. "No, it's just beginning." Ravenhill still stood, a house full of layered memories and lingering ghosts. But for the first time, I no longer felt like the one quietly tending the flame in the shadows. Now I was the one lighting the torch, standing in the grand hall, letting the old secrets become not burdens, but legacy. A legacy that wasn't perfect, but truly mine. My story wasn't just about reclaiming a piece of property. It was about reclaiming myself, a person once dismissed by her own family, forgotten in the shuffle of power and inheritance. But through every difficult decision, I learned that recognition doesn't come from demanding it. It comes from living by your values. Ravenhill was preserved, yes. But more importantly, I had protected my voice and my dignity. And that is the legacy I truly want to keep. What do you think about Charlie's decision and how she handled her family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more real-life, emotional stories about family.